All right, we are live. So this is the part where we've never done this before. So I may be speaking to nobody. I may be speaking to untold millions of people. So, hi everybody. It looks like we're starting to get some people popping on board. I think I'll probably give it a minute before I get to the real meat of things so we can actually get a few people to sign on. Hey there. So this is a new thing we're trying. Forgive any rough edges we may have. We haven't tried to do a live sort of in the wild stream like this, and as opposed to a more structured sort of presentation webinar. So the intent here is to sort of have a conversation to allow a little more back and forth, etc. We'll see if it works out that way or if it still is just me kind of talking endlessly. Basically, this is, I guess I'll sort of start off by talking a little bit about what is Electronic Records Day, why are we doing this thing at all? So Electronic Records Day is, I'm not sure, it's a yearly event, maybe a strong word. It's a day of recognition or awareness. Awareness would be the term that came out of the Council of State Archivists, which is a organization I've been working with for a number of years, both here at the Oregon State Archives and my previous position in the state of Illinois. But the Council of State Archivists works towards, as the name would imply, comprised of all of the state and territorial archivists and works towards, working towards overarching archival issues. This can range everything from funding and grants archives are involved with to pressing issues that we're concerned with in terms of technology or in terms of various types of disaster preparedness efforts, things like that. A lot of different activities they do. And one of them that came out of this is this State Electronic Records Initiative, which was a real push to spread awareness and increase the overall level of competency, might be the word, or the level of engagement that we saw at the state level across the country dealing with electronic records. They are a pressing area of concern. They are the dominant form, if it's a broad term, the dominant form of the kind of content we're dealing with these days. And so if we don't address some of the challenges surrounding them, we are doing ourselves a disservice, both for now and in the future. And so Electronic Records Day came out of this as, the joke was it was on 1010, so it's like binary 1010. I've been involved for a number of years, and so it often involves we create some materials and spread them, share information both for the general public, so sort of personal, digital archiving, that sort of thing, as well as with government agencies, which is of course what we're more in tune with on a regular basis, so to speak. I realized I started all this without introducing myself. Clearly, I have not done these enough. So my name's Chris Stenson. I am the administrator for the Oregon Records Management Solution, which is actually a big statewide initiative. I'll talk about that a little bit, just about some of the efforts we're doing here at the Oregon State Archives. So for the purpose of this, I have a long experience working with electronic records. I've served at 2 different state archives as sort of an electronic records specialist, and so this is why I'm the one on camera here. While you're seeing my extremely shiny dome, I'm going to try to move my thing down a little bit so I realize I'm not actually looking up at you very well. Trying to get this a little better, and that's not good. So. Anywho, that's the genesis of Electronic Records Day. That's where it came from. It's now, let's see, we started I think in 2011. So we've been at it for a while, and we keep trying to expand the footprint and make more people aware of this sort of thing. So fortunately, I think overall we're in much better shape in the field, in the country, and government in general than we were a few years ago. Certainly, the National Archives has taken great steps towards sort of issuing more guidance and working towards more focused attention to electronic records. And I think a lot of states have also been doing the same. So I see a much higher level of day-to-day familiarity with these issues. Right, so I got a question here, and what I will be doing here, so I've got a little chat box. I haven't done this before, so I'm figuring it out. So I've got some talking points that we'll kind of go over, and I've got a chat box over here that you can't see as I point to, of course. So I'll be addressing questions as they come up, and if I have to come back to you. I don't take it the wrong way. I'll try to catch them where I can. So got a question here. Wonder if you have plans to digitize legislative history documents that are currently only available on microfilm. So that's one of those questions that I will demur somewhat. So the decision on what to digitize and when and what we can digitize is tied into a lot of things. Unfortunately, number one thing is resources. And that's not necessarily a fiscal commitment always, but a time commitment. The reality is we have a pretty lean staff here at the archives, and so it can be real challenging. We get a lot of questions about, why don't you just digitize everything? And we, the kind of glib answer is, well, we could start now and we'd be done in 50 years or so if we spent all our time doing it. The reality is that it takes quite a bit of time to do it properly. You can slap something on a photo scanner and do it pretty quickly, but it's not going to be something you'd want to keep or use. So I would tell you that, and full disclosure, I'm not always familiar with all aspects of everything we've got planned at the archives. So I work in one area. I work in records management specifically. So certain types of collections, though, are unlikely to be digitized en masse just because of that sort of crunch. We don't have, and even if, it's not necessarily a begging for money thing. It's just a matter of, we could double the staff in some of these situations and have half of them just doing digitization, and we'd still not really make a dent. So we often have to look at what's going to be the biggest impact point, what's going to give us the most bang for our buck, so to speak, with the resources we do have. And that may mean more of a scan on demand or provide access to when as needed. And that's kind of an evolving thing. But we do appreciate hearing feedback on what things should be prioritized. Certainly that goes into the factor, and that's something that I will absolutely, we will continue to look into in terms of what it is that gets, next on the list, so to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about some of the other things we do here at the archives, and I'll keep an eye on for questions there. So for those of you who may not be familiar, so the question might be, what does the Oregon State Archives do? What is our role in the state on a general level, and specifically, why are we involved with electronic records of any sort? So the Oregon State Archives, of course, I think people are familiar. We are the permanent repository or the repository for permanent government records. That sort of goes without saying. So for many, for many years, of course, we're the ones that take paper records and other things that are deemed to be permanent, of permanent value. What we find ourselves now is at sort of a junction point here in the 21st century where the sort of collections that government agents, I should clarify, the content we take in is from government agencies. So we take in, we're not the State Historical Society, we don't take personal papers and manuscripts, but we do take government records. So anything generated from government agencies in Oregon, basically, state agencies and some local depending on circumstances, but not writ large. So when we are faced with electronic records, so these days government agencies are creating more and more electronic content. They're creating a lot less paper. So they are then, what are we doing in terms of addressing that sort of challenge? Because it represents a very different sort of challenge. You can't maintain them within our stacks. We're not going to stick a bunch of stacks of disks on our shelves or something like that. And I'll get to that in a minute, why that may not be a great idea. So it requires a whole nother level of management and active engagement. We at the archives have really taken a very proactive approach towards that. So the idea being that we can't necessarily sit back and wait for records to just come to us or for things to happen. Because the reality is that a record that may need to be kept for many decades, may be kept for 40, 50, 60 years, or permanently in this case, in the case of stuff that would come to us. If we don't engage early, if it's not maintained well early on, it'll very likely never reach us in a usable form. So things change too quickly. So we have engaged very heavily with the outside community of government agencies, and it's something we continue to work at a lot. So part of this is we do offer regular training and outreach for government agencies, and this is something that is available. And I'm actually going to put this on our website. Let's see if this works. I've got queued up here. There it is. So on our website, and I'm going to put this into the chat there, So that link takes us to our archives page, and that's where we post on our records management page, post available trainings. Now, these trainings, I would note, these trainings are for government agencies. You sign up through iLearn. They're for any level of government. However, we also do seek to do outreach to the public, make greater awareness for that sort of thing. We have done sort of open events in the past and probably will do so in the future. It's always just a matter, again, if you're interested in seeing something like that, let us know. There's various contact links on our site, and let us know that if you're a member of the public, private community, would like to see us do more of that sort of thing, we're always happy to. But we do a lot of outreach and training, topics ranging from just basic records management to how do we deal with records in complex data systems, how do we deal with modern communication technologies, and how do we deal with disaster preparedness. That was one, we actually held one earlier today. One of our other folks did that one, talking about how do we prepare for the worst, when we have a major environmental catastrophe that hits us, or just a building-centric catastrophe. How do you recover from that from a records perspective? So as well as the outreach and engagement, we're trying to actually go out. We do a lot of this stuff via webinar, so to be sort of available to as many people as possible. But we also sort of do these periodic sort of road trips where we drive to different places in the state. Earlier in the summer, I did a road trip around the east side of the state, hitting some places we haven't been in a while. And it's something we're always trying to do more of. So we're always happy to try to do more of that, to make sure our community at large is sort of engaged. One of the big programs that we've been doing for programs is the wrong term, excuse me. One of the big duties we have here in my unit specifically is we oversee retention schedules for state, local agencies, and everything in between. And a retention schedule is basically the lists that government agencies go off of what the records they have and how long they're supposed to keep them. So those schedules they get stale over time, because as you imagine, the way we work changes as time goes on. And so it's an ongoing effort always to keep those up to date. And so that's an ongoing work we're always doing to make sure that the schedules we have out there for agencies reflect the way work is done, so they can be used easily, so they can actually serve the purpose they're supposed to serve. And then I personally am engaged, as well as the rest of our team here, in operating the Oregon Records Management System, which is, Oregon Records Management Solution. I can't even remember my own acronyms. The Oregon Records Management Solution, which is a unique in this country operation where we work actively with government agencies, big and small across the state, and engage them. Work with them and provide tools to allow them to do electronic records management on site. And what that means is we actually work with a private partner on this, and we operate sort of software as a service style, so that agencies can buy into it and basically become members of this organization. We have around 60 agencies now of any size, tiny little things, all the way really big state agencies. Which sort of the idea is we democratize the tools. So the challenge always when we're dealing with the electronic environment is that costs can be prohibitive, especially if you're a small municipality that doesn't have a lot of excess resources or expertise on site. So we're seeking to kind of level the playing field a little bit and make sure that when an agency wants to do a good job with their records, they want to do things effectively and the most to hold the public trust, as best they can, they have the tools to do so. They're not stuck. People are like, why are they so slow? Because they just don't have the tools they need. So we try to help provide that, and we help provide training for that the software that's used, as well as sort of advice on how it structures. So we make sure that agencies are able to better manage that. So that's my role as the administrator of that here for the archives. And we have a very talented team here of folks that work regularly. And it's really, I think it's been a real benefit for those agencies, and promises in the future to ease the transition for when we do have those permanent records that need to come to the archives. Well, they're already going to be managed well. So it's going to be a more seamless transition. So that's sort of what we do in our background here. So I've got here's a question I've preloaded. I'm still looking for other questions coming in, but so here's a thought, and this could apply equally to any of you who may be at a government agency, or those of you who may simply be a member of the public. So they say, well, what do I do with, so I've taken my records, my personal records, my work records, whatever the case may be. Maybe it's photographs, maybe it's videos, maybe it's maybe it's your financial documents, tax documents, that sort of thing. So I've taken these things and I burned them to CDs. You know, these CDs, and oh, but not just any CDs. I bought archival discs, the gold ones, the expensive ones, that they've told me they will last for 100 years. So isn't that good enough? I've stored them on these discs. What's wrong with that? And you know, there's some spectacular marketing at play out there. I'm not saying archival discs are bad. I'm going to tell you right now that no archives has necessarily said these are, you know, we didn't certify these. It's this kind of a label that's been applied to them over time, and they, for those of you who may not be familiar, here's a standard rewritable CD here. Okay, it's gold on the front, but this is not a gold disc. Okay, so the standard rewritable disc, the sort of thing you could stick into your computer and burn, uses on the substrate, it's called, on the underside here, uses various organic dyes. So there's a layer in here that when you stick it into the drive for it to write, it's using a laser to basically burn little pits in the dye and make patterns that they can then be interpreted. Basically codes it so that a disk drive can read it and interpret that as information. So that's your family photos or your work documents or your tax documents or whatever. So the trick with this, in order to make, this is different, for instance, than say a commercial CD you might buy with music on it. Those are actually made, and they are actually engraved into the material. So the material itself is not, it's not a dye layer that's been burned. It's actually, there's actually a texture to the substrate, so it's actually more sturdy. The dye is used in rewritable. For those of you, if I'm slightly inaccurate on that, nobody call me out on it, okay? So the dye layer on a rewritable disk, however, breaks down with exposure to light. The very thing that makes it writable in the first place, namely laser light being able to burn it into a pattern, unfortunately also renders it somewhat prone to degradation when exposed to other types of light, or just time itself, or heat, etc. So you can take one of these disks, and I have many. So I went to college, you know, when I was doing my undergrad, it was right around the turn of the century, which is a funny thing to say, but right around 2000 to 1999. And you know, rewritable discs were the rage then. We were all hot on that, and we were burning all sorts of stuff to these things. And I can tell you, I still have stashes of them floating around. Occasionally, I'll dig one out, and most of them are completely unreadable. They have broken down to the point where the data content is no longer recoverable, or it's completely corrupted because it's just been faded. So what can happen with these sort of things is the dye layer breaks down, the dye itself breaks down and loses the content. Of course, we also know that these things are super easy to scratch. You know, once you've scratched them up too badly, they don't read anymore. The top layer, so this layer you're seeing on the top of the disk, is actually the backside of the stuff you're writing to. So if you scratch this surface off, unlike, again, this is another thing, unlike a commercial disk that's got another plastic layer on top to protect it. In this case, this top surface, you scratch that off, that's gone. It's physically removing the data from it. So these guys are problematic from that end. So the gold archival disks claim to sort of fix this problem by giving it, and I don't know all the technology that goes into the aspects of it. Basically, it gives it a more non-reactive substrate, so it's literally gold in a lot of cases, and is protected on the top, et cetera, et cetera. They say, well, these things have been shown to last, so long as you're not, again, playing Frisbee with them, last for 100 years. To which I say, okay, let's posit that. Let's say, now mind you, this has all been done with accelerated aging testing. There's no guarantee that that's actually the case, but we'll go ahead and take that. So that's fine. So let's say, let's look at a few other things that may have been technologies that may have lasted a while. So we got some of these bad boys right here. So this right here is what, a 7.5 inch, maybe it's a 7, I always forget, 7 3/4. In any case, a big old disc. So this was a technology that people were like, yeah, this is pretty good. When's the last time you saw a writer or a reader in a computer for one of those? Okay, we'll get a little more modern. 3.5 inch floppies. Okay, these you might still be able to find a disk drive, but usually you can get them external. The data on here may be okay so long as it hasn't been exposed to a magnet. But again, what are you really reading on? No modern computer comes with these things. You have to retrofit, and those days are rapidly disappearing. Talking about technology dead ends. Here's this is a zip disk, not a jazz disk. So again, of being in jumping into the world of technology, computer technology a lot in the late 90s, these things were all the rage. They were seen because they were so much larger. They could fit these things, what, 100 megabytes fit on one of these suckers versus what, 3 on a diskette, and we weren't really to burnable CDs yet. Boy, these were seen as a great thing. But again, a proprietary technology, very limited support for it after a while. And once the company stopped making them, nearly impossible to get the content. Not to mention, these things were horrendously unstable and terrible to use. The problem with the technology, of course, is that we don't always know what's going to last and what's not. Anyone remember the Blu-ray versus HD DVD thing a few years back? You know, they were both viable technologies that came out at the same time. Or go back a bit further, Betamax versus VHS. My family had a Beta player. We bet wrong. So this sort of thing happens all the time. So these sort of technologies put out by a particular company cannot necessarily be trusted long term. Other sort of dead-end technologies, mini DV tapes. Anybody have any home videos on these? So I know I do. They are, in fact, this is actually a digital tape. It's not an analog recording mechanism. It is a digital tape, and you can still, if you have a camcorder to put them into and plug it into the computer, you can still read these. But again, the technology support for them is very much in the I happen to have some stuff stashed variety and not buying new products for them. You know, more recently, we're doing, dropping things. We're doing these bad boys. So USB flash drives, okay? So they have the advantage, of course, of being widely supported still because USB ports are on everything. But again, will not forever be. So looping back to my original long ago question to myself. So what's wrong with a 100-year disk? Well, so you may have a disk in 100 years, but what are you going to read it on? So that's the real question. So there is no, and this is sort of the mantra, repeat after me, there is no permanent format. There is no permanent storage media. Whatever you're using now will not be used for more than a couple decades. And then there will be some long-term support. You know, CD drives, for example, are still pretty prevalent, but a lot of new computers are now, you know, the sort of fancier form factor ones don't even have one in there. You know, we're moving to tablets and smartphones. Well, they aren't going to fit one of these in there. So this is already a dying technology. And while there's going to be a lot of legacy support, you are painting yourself into a bad corner. Not to mention that the only way to know how your stuff is doing when it's on a external removable thing, like a little piece of media like this, is to load the disk and take a look to check your stuff. And that is a time-consuming process. It's problematic. So it's not really a long-term strategy of any sort, whether you're government or whether you're private, whatever. For my own stuff, I wouldn't burn it to CDs, much less that. Even these little guys. So this little USB flash drive, you know, uses technology that's still very much a going thing. It's not going away anytime soon, for sure. But there's one real significant problem with these, and that is how many of these have you had, and how many do you still have? It's like the tube of chapstick you have in your pocket. I can't tell you the last time I actually finished one of these things. Because you always manage to lose them before you get to that point. When you do finish them, it feels like a notable event. Well, look what's about the exact same size, a little smaller, in fact. So this thing, just as easy to lose. So while the technology itself is pretty stable, you know, it's not sensitive to a lot of the stuff that older technologies were. You can kind of drop these things and bang them around a bit, and they hold up pretty well. In some cases, you can even get them wet and dry them out again and use them. And they do have a lifespan. What people may not realize is that eventually solid-state drives like this, little solid-state media, will just stop working. They have a limited number of write and rewrites they can do, but it's rare that anybody gets to that point unless you're doing a sort of commercial setting for it. So you and I at home are unlikely to hit the maximum number of writes and rewrites on this, although sometimes they go bad. But the bigger risk really is just you're going to misplace this thing. You're going to lose it. So portability is both an advantage and a disadvantage in these things. So, and again, you're still stuck to take this, plug it into your computer, and check what you got on there. So this is a long meandering story, I know. So if I'm saying don't use removable media at all, what should you be using? Well, I think we're at a point now where we're inevitably moving towards the cloud. Everybody hears about the cloud. You know, the cloud is nothing magical. It is simply storage that is somewhere else, usually with some layer of computing on top of it, depending on what you're doing. So if you're using your Google Drive at home or at work, that's just a cloud storage. It's just servers elsewhere storing your stuff, and you can remotely access it wherever. Super handy. There are some advantages and disadvantages naturally. Now, there's always we do talk to, when we work with government agencies, we talk about you know, what's an appropriate usage of cloud technology and what might not be. And it's not that we have, you know, there was a lot of suspicion about cloud technology a few years ago. Any new tech, you know, we want to take a good look at it first. Cloud technology in itself is not necessarily a dirty word. It's the way things are going, and it's not going to change. People don't want to be worrying about all their own infrastructure. But we do have to be concerned about a few different factors with that. So we have to think about ownership of data, as always. So particularly, now this is a concern both for private citizens and for government. We already know that anytime you're not paying for something, you are the product. So if you've got your as I do this on Facebook, you've got your free Facebook account, you've got your free Google account. Those companies are getting something out of it, and they're mining data in most things. You sign that end user license agreement, you know, without reading it, and it basically gives them permission broadly to use a lot of your data. So they're getting something out of it. So be aware of that. If you are going into storing a bunch of your personal materials, potentially sensitive, whether they're sensitive from a government standpoint or sensitive from you personally, you want to think really hard about what you want to have in the cloud, in an environment that you don't directly control. You want to make sure that the ownership of such content, you know, others may have access to it by the nature of the service you're using, but you want to make sure that you have the ability to retrieve that whenever you need to. That's particularly crucial with government, of course, because we deal with public records that we are required to have for certain periods of time. And if we fail to do that, that liability is on us. We have failed to maintain records appropriately. Those are records that we can't reconstitute potentially, that nobody can see, and that's a bad thing for many reasons. So we always want to go in with our eyes open. Make sure we're aware. Make sure that we aren't locking our records, our content, behind many software walls that will prevent us from retrieving them later. Because this is often a challenge. We put things up here, and it's not just storage environment like your Google Drive, but maybe say there's a database involved. Maybe there's a software that you're accessing it through. Is that software the only way to access that content now? Do you have the ability to pull it out and use it later, or is it all going to be intertwined in a way that doesn't make sense away from the mothership, so to speak? So those are things that everybody needs to ask themselves. I personally use a hodgepodge in my life, I think, like everybody else does. So I actually still, for all my family photos, of which we take 1 billion, and this is where I say, you know, what do we use for taking photos these days? One of these bad boys. Some of us have real cameras, and we pull them out once in a blue moon because they just seem so inconvenient, even if they take nicer pictures. So what are we doing with these? Well, often you'll have an automatic cloud backup with these, or a storage. If you're using an iPhone or something, I know that sort of comes built in. But otherwise, they're on this one device, and then maybe they're up in the cloud. I personally, even if it is backing certain things up, I want to make sure that my content that matters to me is located somewhere that I can control it to an extent. So I actually still use on my computer at home. I periodically will load the photos onto that, or if, you know, documents I've got, if I'm doing my taxes and things like that, I store them all electronically. But I'm not just keeping them on the one computer. I'm also keeping them on one of these bad boys. So this is an external hard drive. Again, nothing magical about it. So the trick is, of course, none of these will last forever. This hard drive will not last forever as well. I'm never planning on leaving it on one piece of media forever. I will eventually replace this hard drive with another one, and I will copy things over, and I will replace it before it dies. But what I do is, so even if I've got other backups, I have a backup program running on my computer that automatically will make copies of any new content onto my backup hard drive. And so I have a backup hard drive attached there. And another nice thing about that, if we're talking about sort of personal concerns, so people will use cloud storage because of the fact that it's somewhere else. So if my house burns down, you know, that's gone as well. That's definitely an advantage of that. With my personal hard drive, if I keep all of my important documents on that as well, there's also an added advantage. Not quite as good for, because if my house is on fire, I'm probably not running to my office to grab this. But if I have to evacuate my home, that sort of thing, I can grab the one device that will then be interoperable somewhere else, and I have all of my information on it. So I like to maintain a redundant backup. I actually tend to have about 2 backups. One might be cloud in some case. One is one of these. So I'm not a Luddite against cloud backups by any stretch of the imagination. It's just making sure that you're aware of where your stuff lives and how you get to it. That's always the key part. Is having it's only half the battle. Having it and not being able to access it is a much bigger problem. So, and that goes across the board. It's something we work with all the time. Okay. So on that same bent, so I talk about storage formats. So I just did my little show and tell with all my nice visual aids that I put together here. But what about file formats? Let's talk about file formats a little bit. So file formats, people are familiar with. So you've got your Word documents, and depending on how old they are, they may be either a .doc file, a doc file, or they may be a .docx file. What's that mean? Not a lot to you or me. It just happens to be a change in how Microsoft stored their file formats back in, I forget which version it changed at now, somewhere in the mid 2000s. So like anything, file formats will go obsolete. So I can tell you right now that I wrote a lot of my college term papers as an undergrad on a Mac, and I wrote it using a version of WordPerfect that is 15, 20 years out of date, and on a machine that I don't have anymore. And so I know I lost a lot of those along the way. This will happen with any of them. Even if you've got file formats that are relatively widely used, at some point, the Reaper will come for them as well. So in a government context, we actually will lay out lists of formats for agencies that they're supposed to use. They are actually present in our rules, and they're off our archives website that lay out certain types of formats. Now, it's not meant to be the end-all be-all, but basically if you have documents, you want PDFs at a certain point. So because PDFs are an open standard, that's a key part of longevity for file formats. So open standards means that that multiple companies can make tools to access them. They aren't locked up with one company, so that while Adobe may own the infrastructure surrounding the PDF file type, they have opened up that standard so you can get third-party readers for it. And what that does is it kind of inoculates you against potentially Adobe going defunct in the future, and all of a sudden all the support for their formats is gone. Well, not the case, because there are so many other, the code's open, so there's so many other tools you could access that you don't lose access to that. And the same sort of thing we look at for movies, for video files. We're looking at MPEG-4, so MP4 files being a preferential. Video is tough because there are a lot of formats out there. But I remember, again, going back to my college days, I remember many different types of files that we would use on a regular basis. .avi files, .mov files, WMV files, depending on the type of player you're using, most of which are locked to a particular environment of software, and you have to download codecs to play them. This is not an optimal environment for preservation or longevity. So you want these sort of formats that are more stable over time. And in fact, let me see if I can on the fly here. Library of Congress maintains a format registry. I queued up some of these things ahead of time, and this is one I forgot to do. Congress file formats. Let's see, where are you? So here we go. Now, some of this stuff gets pretty wonky, fair warning. They go deep into the technical specs on some of these things. But in here, you will find different types of content categories, and they're going to talk about formats. So this may be helpful if you find a file somewhere and it's got an extension that you're not familiar with. Take a look on this registry, and they will sort of say whether they've identified it and whether they like it or not, that sort of thing. It can be a helpful a resource for any of us at home or elsewhere. So it may also give you an indication of maybe this is not a file format I want to be keeping my critical stuff in. So again, so that's where we're at on that. Image files, again, are another one of those areas that depends on what you're trying to do. If you want the highest possible quality, if you want, these things, or there are masters, or you're a photographer taking high quality DSLR pictures, you're going to probably be keeping those in a raw file format of some sort, or a TIFF. These are very large. They have the advantage of having the top possible quality, but they take up a ton of space. And for most of our pictures we're taking with our phones and stuff, it's overkill. We don't need that. So, just trying to, JPEGs are pretty ubiquitous, and while they aren't perfect, for most people, they're probably sufficient in many cases. Sound files, audio files, again, there's a lot of different file formats out there. There's no guarantee of one being better than the others. MP3 is widely used and openly described, so it's another good choice for a compact, usable file format. There are WAV files, are sort of the big uncompressed version, or that people would go with, but again, they take up a lot of space. It's kind of like looking at a TIFF file that might be a gigabyte versus a JPEG that takes you 15 megs. Same sort of thing with the audio files, so you have to decide, what are you needing to do here. how critical is this content. But we ourselves, for a lot of our government audio, only require MP3 because, again, it's an open standard. We don't expect any of these formats to be around or be the default format in a few decades. But the key here is that we identify the ones that are best for now. And then we advise agencies to stay on top of what they have. So knowing what you have is sort of the best inoculation against potentially losing it. So then if you saw, a company says, or a company goes under, or somebody says, Microsoft says, I'm withdrawing support. Yes, Microsoft is a person. They are going to withdraw support for, Office 97 file formats. Okay, eventually it may happen. It's not there yet. Well, there's going to be a lead time on that. But if you know already that, hey, in our inventory, we have X number of files in this format, or we can quickly look that up because of how we managed it, that gives you the opportunity to identify those, do what's called a migration, where you copy them into a current format that is more widely acceptable, still used widely, that sort of thing. Give you a chance to do that. So you don't have to be scared just because you can't see the end game. People love to get really tied to these sort of the ideas of this permanence, because we miss the permanence we had, real or in our minds with paper. The idea that, this is a thing that if I keep it well, it'll last for hundreds of years or more. And so we have to sort of change the way we think about it, in that it's no longer about permanence. It's about knowledge. It's about knowing what you have, and then knowing when those things are going to go away. So that's what we do. It's systems of paying attention to what you have, complete inventories, and then moving those along. So it's kind of like you're driving. An analogy would be you're driving 100 miles. You're driving 100 miles to see your family. You can't see the whole way there when you start off. You don't know what you're going to run into. Now, for this analogy, I realize that we're pretending you don't have Google Maps up. But generally speaking, you don't see all the way there. You don't know what you're going to run into. And you certainly don't know if there's going to be a coyote around the next corner in the middle of the road, or there's an accident that just happened, or, any number of things like that. But we have a whole system of things that allow us to see far enough ahead to make adjustments as we go. So we have eyeballs. We have various controls on the car. We have headlights to show us the way. So we can see a few hundred yards ahead sometimes, or maybe much further. But that's enough time. That's enough space to make changes as we go. So that's what we're doing essentially in the digital world, is we are adjusting as we go. We don't have all the answers for what's going to be in 15 or 20 years. We are just simply watching the technology, adapting it as we go along, and working our way towards that. So that's kind of our ethos, and it kind of gets us past that trap of thinking that, no, we need to find a thing, because for a long time we've tried we in the field and in population in general have tried to find the thing. We love to find the thing, and companies love to take advantage of our love for the thing. But there is no thing. Does that make sense? Just repeat after me. There is no thing. Okay, have I bored everybody enough with my really wonky talk about file formats? This is what happens when you don't force me to use a script or something, because I can just talk about whatever I want to talk about. It's kind of liberating. Let's see here. Somebody wants to throw me a question, or I'm just going to keep going, I guess. Let's see here. Oh, do I? I'm sorry. Hang on. For some reason, I'm not seeing it. Hang on. I have one of my colleagues down the saying, you have a question, and I can't see it. Maybe my colleague down the way can feed me the question off camera, and I can find it. Because I apologize if I've been talking over somebody. For some reason, I'm not seeing. It doesn't let me scroll all the way back. And again, this is the hazards of live video, right? Okay, so I'm going to omit a few of the specifics, but in general, the crux of the question was, if an agency, if a government entity has purged records in accordance with their records retention schedule. So as I mentioned earlier, a retention schedule is dictated by the state archives. The state archivist is the one that has authority to approve these things, and that's what says, for example, that you keep this record for 6 years and that one for 10 years and that one's permanent. If they have destroyed records in accordance with their schedule, no, we do not. We do not have them. The question, sorry, finish the question. The question was, if they have destroyed them in accordance with their schedule, are any of those in the possession of the state archives? And the answer is no. We only take records that are designated permanent. That's capital P, permanent. So they have no destruction on them. And often in the schedule, you will see, if you read the schedule, it will say maintain for X number of years and then transfer to the archives, if that's the case. Otherwise, in many cases, if you were talking about a local entity or a county entity, they don't transfer those to us automatically. They often maintain their own permanent archives. Only in certain situations do we actually take those records, and honestly it just comes down to we don't possibly have this, we don't have the space to manage all of that, so we don't have the ability to do all of that. We do take them in certain extraordinary circumstances, often in places where they found a stash of what may be of more valuable records, older records, and they're in a facility that's really substandard. We have had times when we would sort of take possession to keep them safe, but generally speaking, we don't. And no, if they have destroyed them appropriately, we certainly don't have extra copies. That's sort of the whole point of records disposition, is that, which kind of segues to a talking point I was going to think about was, why do we do destructions? Why? Because there's often people sort of think, oh, aren't you in the records preservation business? And we sort of are, but the key part here is that think about the amount of content you create, anybody creates on a daily basis. We create tons of content, especially in the digital world. There's some interesting illustrative graphs or numbers, and if I had thought about this ahead of time, I probably would have tried to queue them up, but of succeeding presidential administrations and the amount of emails specifically they created, and we're talking from the early 90s on through the successive ones, and it's like a little bit more, and then just straight up. It's the amount of information is beyond our ability to really even get at. And so we have schedules to some extent to identify the stuff that actually is valuable long term, that might actually have some lasting value beyond that initial administrative use, and focus on that, because there's no way we can keep it all and actually have it be accessible. There's no way we'd be able to sift through that sheer amount of bulk and actually provide any sort of reasonable access to it in most cases, because it's just, there's too much of it. When you're bogged down by every lunch request and sick, person saying, hey, I'm going to be sick today, or I'm out sick today, or all those sort of the day-to-day stuff that just drowns out a lot of the other more valuable content. So that's part of the weighting mechanism we do is to focus on what's the stuff that actually has lasting value, and we measure that out. And the shorter term stuff still has a rubric that goes into it. So we look at, is there a lasting fiscal value? So do you need this to show fiscal requirements? Is there administrative value? So you just need this to do your job for a certain period of time? And are there legal requirements? So are there laws on the books that would say you have to keep records for this long? And then that's where we go off first. And then the last little bit that says historical value, that's the part where we come and say, well, you're done with all of your original purposes. It doesn't help you guys anymore, but this serves a lasting thing that we think would be valuable long term. So that was a very long answer to a fairly succinct question, but that's something I'm pretty good at. Any other questions I've missed, folks? Yes, I did. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, unfortunately, we're learning the platform as we go, right? All right. So let's see here. I've got a couple more little things to talk about here. If I can figure out which ones I've already done, which ones I haven't. So here's a question that I would I guess I'm going to throw an existential question back at me. And so if electronic records present such a challenge, if we have all this problem, why didn't we just stick with paper? This is a question that we will have. We have a lot of people that probably wish we did stick with paper. But there are distinct advantages. We don't want to be negative all the time about this. Like any newer technologies, there will be unforeseen challenges that come along with it. But when we think about the revolution in the ability to communicate information rapidly and efficiently between people, there's really no comparison. We work with agencies on the regular to help them sort of streamline their processes. The idea is that Where say it's something, you're getting a form from the public. So you get a form in the past. Somebody submits a paper form. They mail it to you. They show up at your desk, hand you this form. Great. I've got this form. I am now going to go and I'm going to transcribe this into some other system, some other thing we're dealing with. I'm going to make duplicates of this form, send it to 2 other people in interoffice memos so they can approve or deny it or do something with that. That form is going to move from person to person. Maybe somebody's on vacation. It sits on their desk for a week. They get back, oh, got to take care of this. Then it moves along. And then finally, when we're done with this form, it's going to get filed in a file cabinet somewhere, taking up space. So this whole process can be very lengthy and time-consuming and is fraught with potential choke points, places where it can get hung up. So you take that same process and we say, okay, now, instead of that form, we're going to have a digital form. They fill it out on the web. It gets right to us. It automatically enters that information into our database for searching. It's going to send notifications to the individuals who need to review it. They're going to get that in their little job queue. They're going to take it. They're going to look at that document. They're going to review it. They're going to approve it. It's going to get filed within a storage system that is fully indexed already, and that's done. What we see, and that's a simplification. That's a very generic sort of description, but we do this thing with the software we use, with the program that we operate, an Oregon Records Management solution. We really focus, we bring a lot of government efficiency. So it's a huge benefit, because what happens then is that the person who submitted that form gets their case, claim, application, whatever, filed and done much more rapidly. That file is then immediately searchable for other retrieval if we need it. Once it's in a managed system, it will stay for as long as it needs to stay, and it will be disposed of properly because it's not lost in a pile. It's not taking up any physical space. So, I mean, that's a big thing. We're always trying to condense, in government, or, we're under a mandate all the time to be as efficient as we can. We try, we're not perfect at it. But part of that is making better use of the buildings we have, because in many cases we're leasing the buildings, or the buildings were built for less of the people than we have now. And so if we're using up all that space for physical storage, we're not able to bring in more employees, or we're having to lease more space to put the boxes in, or to put the people in. So anything we can do to reduce the footprint is tremendously beneficial from that standpoint. So that's a lot of the sort of work we do, and that's sort of see the number one advantage of electronic records versus paper that I see on a daily basis is it just allows us to do our work so much more efficiently. And yes, it has trade-offs, and we have to deal with it. And we've been a little slow to adjust to that. That's our role now. My role as an electronic records manager of a sort, as an archivist, if you will, is to help put those tools in place so that we can get ahead of these things. And I had a thought there, and then it disappeared. I know we're pretty much at time. I've got one more little talking point, and then any more questions, then we'll probably wrap up. So one more discussion. So let's talk briefly about communication technologies. So communication technologies represent probably the biggest challenge we're facing right now in terms of how do we grab and hold on to the appropriate content. It's up there with sort of complex data systems. Those are the big data movement, big databases. How do you wrap your head around those? How do you preserve them? Those are a real challenge as well. But electronic communications are something we all engage with. Most of us don't deal with massive data sets, and so it's kind of an abstract concept. Big data sounds. However, we all have a smartphone these days, pretty much. We all use various social media platforms. We use email, of course, all of us do. So all of these communication technologies have a challenge in that, we're creating a lot more content than we didn't used to. If we work in a government context, a lot of this content is a public record by default. So if I'm sending texts about work, if I am using social media to engage with other agencies or with the public as a representative of the archives, all of these things are public records. Potentially that would need to be preserved for a period of time. Now, a lot of these things are not long-term public records. They're not super valuable in all cases, depending on who I am and what I'm doing. If I'm posting a redundant notice to Facebook that we put out as a press release, that redundant notice that says, hey, there's an open house this weekend, is not going to be a super valuable thing long-term because there's other documentation of that. However, if I am, I don't know, an elected official, posting new information via a social media platform, I can't imagine why anybody would do that. But if I am in that person doing that thing, you can bet that the sort of information that I'm putting up there would be in the public interest and is a public record. So, and we run across a challenge with this all the time, not just because of perhaps a poor understanding of whether or not it should be considered a public record, but the very apparatus we're using is not under our control. So it's another one of those situations where we are now using we are not paying for a third-party service that can do whatever they want. So if I'm posting stuff to Facebook, they're not required to maintain that on my page for any length of time. They can delete it whenever they want if they decide, because they feel like it, if they feel it violates a policy, or they just cause. And there's not a lot of recourse for that. So it's very important for, particularly in the government context, all of us to go in with our eyes open and understand that it's our responsibility to capture that content somehow, to keep copies locally, to make sure what we're putting up is redundant, it's not unique content, or etc. That sort of thing, so we can cover our bases, and that we can provide it if it needs to be provided to the public after the fact. Text messages are tricky as well. So we're using third-party carriers. We may or may not have government-issued phones or business-issued phones. Think about if you're a private citizen and you're in your job, do you have a phone issued by your employer, or do you use your own? Potentially you have stuff that crosses those boundaries. So these are other things that really we work on addressing through policy. We're going to make and education. So we reach out to agencies and make sure they're aware to what's appropriate usage and what may not be appropriate. And I think in a lot of situations, you can get ugly situations because people didn't understand. It's not that anybody's trying to do something malicious. It's that they weren't aware necessarily of, of the repercussions of the sort of work they were doing. So we run across this all the time, and it's something we continue to encourage folks to make sure that they are aware, that their coworkers and their elected officials they work with are aware of their responsibilities. If you're going to use these technologies, they can be very beneficial, and I'm not one to poo-poo it by any means, but they need to go in with their eyes open. They need to make sure that they are acting appropriately, that they are capturing what they need to capture if so, and they are not opening themselves up to a whole whirlwind of problems by doing a poor job of managing those records. So I think that's my last kind of big talking point. This has kind of been interesting, a little meandering, I know, but I guess that's the nature of it. So, but I appreciate everybody that's tuned in. Hope this was valuable. I'd appreciate feedback you may have. So let me real quick. This is a little bit of a hodgepodge, but I think I'm going to go ahead and post the. We have a survey for trainings, and this may not directly apply to everybody, but I would appreciate it. I'm going to post it in the little link here. And put that there. So if you can go ahead and take a second and fill in that form, just tell me, and don't worry about too much of the details, just let me know if you felt this format was useless, interesting, you'd like to see more, maybe other topics we could tackle, whether you think it's a viable format. So we'll decide whether we want to do more of these for other events or just cause in the future. But other than that, appreciate everybody showing up again. So go out and preach the gospel of electronic records, and I'll see you guys later.